Canada has been observing the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation since it was established as a federal holiday in 2021. And what a special guest we're able to bring to our program today. The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, is in Ottawa today. National Chief, a pleasure to have you on this day of all days. Thank you for giving me some time.
Thank you for having us.
Can I begin with your message? But let's speak specifically to Indigenous communities today. What is your message to them on this 5th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation?
Well, on this National Day, of course, for Truth and Reconciliation, the Assembly of First Nations, we remember and we honor the thousands of First Nations children, survivors, and intergenerational survivors and their families who were taken from their homes, separated from our communities, from our languages, and subjected to abuse in Canada's residential school system. And, we have a lot of work to do on the Truth and Reconciliation 94 calls to action. We're leading up to the 10th anniversary since the release of those 94 calls this December. And how far have we come as a country?
Well, let me ask you that question. I wanted to ask you that particularly. This is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation since the passing of the Commissioner, Murray Sinclair. So a lot of discussion about this, and we're reporting on how much work is yet to do. How would you assess how much progress has been made in this time?
Look, I think we have some progress. We have a lot more work to do. I know that one, for instance, is call number 30, on justice and people that are incarcerated. There's, 7,000 men incarcerated across this country, 4,000 women, too much that shouldn't be incarcerated. And I think that that's one really tough discussion to get through. But it's so important as a country that we talk about these uncomfortable truths. We also, we continue to call upon the government to step up its efforts in the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And we should grade ourselves this December. I know that there's some work underway already, and we need to continue to go call through call. And, how far have we come on each of those calls to make this country a more just society for everyone and to close the infrastructure gap. Basic things, for instance, like kids that, all of our kids in towns and cities take for granted: access to hospitals, access to good infrastructure with schools, and access to water. And then, you look at our kids in First Nations communities, and we need those investments to close those infrastructure gaps on schools, on housing, on roads, on basic things that children need: access to clean drinking water, and even things like access to a cell phone or to Wi-Fi, high-speed internet. Mm-hmm. These are things that Canada, they're always tough to talk about, but it's so important that we do, so that we close these gaps off for our kids. And as the late Murray Sinclair, and we honor him as well today, one of his lines to all of us as a community and as to Canada was, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. So making sure, we're calling the Assembly of First Nations, we're calling on Canada, in the next federal budget here to make a historic investment into our language, education, and culture, once in a generation, to close that off. And, I think that we can do it. I think I'll also say, Canadians as well, when I was talking to First Nations last night about this, when there's corporate boardrooms or industry and government and education and educational institutions and sports organizations, and when you look around your board table, when you have boards right across this country, everywhere, is there First Nations people on those boards? I think that that's one thing we can also look at and work towards together as a country. Absolutely.
Well, I began with a message that you might deliver to Indigenous communities today, but I was wondering, and you just touched on it there, but I was in downtown Toronto yesterday, just happened to be walking around, taking notice of just how many orange shirts, as you're wearing. Certainly many more. I would imagine I'll see them everywhere today, but many more in advance, and many being worn by non-Indigenous Canadians, or at least it appeared to me. So I'm not sure what you think about the growing awareness of some of these needs, but what is your message to non-Indigenous Canadians on this day?
Well, look, first of all, I want to thank them for, lifting up. Being in a restaurant yesterday, for instance, I'd seen somebody, like 5 different people wearing shirts the day before. But just seeing that, it brought, I was thankful for that. I didn't know who these Canadians were, but I was so happy that they were wearing these shirts and that we're remembering the true history of what had happened in our country, although it's not pretty. These discussions are tough to have. We're just starting out. Look, the Pope just apologized in 2021, and and then of course he had passed away. There's still work going on that between the church and First Nations. But I think as a country as a whole, making sure that we're making a better life for all children, including First Nations children, and remembering, the effects that residential schools had on our First Nations communities.
Yes. Well, further to that point, just yesterday in Saskatchewan, we had Premier Moe making an apology officially. We were covering that this morning and putting forward a $40 million compensation fund to add to some 27 in federal funding, but provincial monies to the tune of $40 million for the Isle Lacrosse Residential School, which is a Métis residential school which predated the federal system. So there is still work being done on this journey toward reconciliation. What was your thought on what happened specifically in Saskatchewan yesterday?
I was thankful for Premier Moe's leadership. I sent him a text last night, and I thank him for that, because I think that people could, governments included, can always kick the ball down the line and leave it for another day, leave it for another court day. And, when you see, issues like this put to rest, it always makes for a better Canada for everyone. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about some of the things that you want to see from the federal government perspective, the infrastructure gap being reduced, eliminated. We heard you make those remarks powerfully when you spoke to the General Assembly, your National Assembly earlier, when we were listening live to those comments. The partnership with the new government under Prime Minister Mark Carney, he has just issued a statement, actually, National Chief, and it's an extensive one, but I want to read you part of what he has just said. On this day, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, the Prime Minister writes this: Canada's new government will be a steadfast partner by respecting self-determination, by prioritizing Indigenous equity and co-ownership as vital principles of building, and by recognizing that true partnership first requires shared understanding, and that building Canada requires Indigenous and non-Indigenous voices to lead in the shared stewardship of this land. Because it is vital that we build, but equally vital how we build, with Indigenous leadership, prosperity, and opportunity being foundational. Reconciliation is a generational task, lived and practiced every day. It's an excerpt of the Prime Minister's statement this morning, National Chief. How do you receive that?
Look, I appreciate Mark Carney's words, and action will tell. Like, I think the federal budget will tell us a lot about this government, their priorities, and their commitment towards First Nations. I have to commend the previous Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, for for creating and setting the bar high for future prime ministers. I also want to remember people like the former Prime Minister Paul Martin, who had, wanted to invest back then on, into First Nations people, and setting that bar as well. And I think that the bar keeps increasing, and we look to Prime Minister Carney to continue on with that work, and any future Prime Minister after that. But at the same time, there is a federal budget this fall, and we are calling for a once-in-a-generation commitment from this government on investments in education and culture and language, and going back to the basics for our kids and making sure that they get the best that they can. I also want to remind, I know that we want to I just want to remind Canada today that as well, trickle down, economics are not going to close the infrastructure gap for children in First Nations communities. And we have to do better when it comes to access to fresh, clean drinking water in our First Nations communities, on housing, on access to more infrastructure for schools. We've got crumbling infrastructure right across the country, and our little children need schools.
Right.
And we also need, like I said, basic things like high-speed internet and access to cell phone service for our kids. So
I was just checking the date again to remind November the 4th of this year. That is when we will see if indeed those priorities are addressed and continue that conversation. But I just want to, before I let you go today, I know it's going to be a busy day for you. Our CBC Kids News team has assembled some really interesting comments from young Indigenous Canadians, young Indigenous members of the communities. You talked about what their particular needs are, and I was struck again by the Prime Minister's last line: reconciliation is a generational task, lived and practiced every day. This is what the newest generation is saying about being Indigenous, and I'd like to play their voices for you, National Chief, and then we'll talk about them.
Thank you.
What reconciliation means to me:
learning about the past and learning ways to make the world better and try and make sure that never happens again.
Back then, people were treated wrongly, and that shouldn't happen.
People that went to that school have the right to be in their culture.
Recognizing the First Nations people and how they were treated, and trying to do better right now and in the future.
To remember what has happened to kids in the past, and it reminds me to always be kind to one another.
It means to care about other people.
To recognize the things happening to the past, and the life is not fair for the Indigenous people, and we are trying to make it better.
Connecting with our community and learning.
Just talk about it and just have conversations, have the difficult ones, make good connections with people and have better relationships.
The voices of young Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians there, National Chief. And I was just wondering, as you listen to them and their understanding of what reconciliation means, what does that signal to you for the future?
Look, I have hope in our young people because I think that they're more educated than we were. I know for sure, you look back and there was never any mention of Indigenous peoples or First Nations people in our education institutions, whether that be in grade school or in university or college. And I'm really thankful for what education has done in this country, but they have a longer way to go, and to remembering these stories and the push to also protect the stories of residential school survivors. I know that there's a big court issue for instance on the stories of First Nations people, but these are uncomfortable truths that we have to talk about, like the young person had said in there. And I think that with attitudes like that, we're going to make a better country and stronger for everybody. And I just have hope in our young people.
Positive note, a hopeful note on which to conclude. It's going to be a busy day there in Ottawa. We have special coverage coming for the national commemorations, and we'll be looking for you there. Thank you for your time this morning. I appreciate it.